Hello, everyone. This is Bob Swain. I'm the preacher for the Aniana Church of Christ, back with another podcast. Thanks for listening. This is podcast number 5 from my series of little talks that I've been calling Things Written Aforetime. Usually it's just a story drawn from a biblical idea, written with a bit of poetic license while staying true to the theme of the Bible to the best of my abilities. Usually written with a dash of imagination and hopefully always causing you, the listener, to have a spiritually uplifting thought, or perhaps maybe to spur you in to pick up the good book and read a little. This is podcast number 5, and it's entitled, I Told You So. He sat at the table with his friend and co-worker. He stared at the ground between his feet. His friend stared blankly at the table, neither of them wanting to say very much. They had seen some things in their time, but nothing like what he had just told his friend about. Nothing even came close, and silence seemed fitting. His friend looked up from the table. Just for a brief moment, uneaten food sat longing to be consumed, but that wouldn't happen today. This was not a day of revelry, as these two had shared before in the past. It was a day of solemn reflection, and for one it was a day of disconsolation. His friend went back to staring at the blank spaces on the table between the dishes that held the food rendered inedible by the dialogue of two old friends. He sat at the edge of the table, with his elbows propped on his knees. He brought his gnarled and calloused hands together and began to wring a piece of cloth that he held in his hands, and then he slowly brought it up and wiped his face. The two had been friends for some time and helped each other through some difficult times, but now they were sat pondering if there was any help to be found in such a circumstance as they were faced with. They both were ready to retire from their line of work, and never had their work been one that someone might call fun or fulfilling. It was hard work, physical labor, and dealing with people who didn't appreciate you for what you did, and dealing with coworkers in high-stress situations, which is never fun or fulfilling. And at times it had just been plain dangerous, not to mention the travel, always traveling from this place to that place, always away from family and from home. Yes, it was a difficult job, and they were both ready to go home and just live in peace and quiet. They were both very intelligent and resourceful men, seasoned veterans, I suppose one might say, closer to retirement than many who were still working in their line of work. But they both were still working and bound by duty to do the jobs assigned to them. But this last job had been different for the man holding the cloth. Not different in the nature of the task. It was supposed to be just like any other job, but it had been. And so the two old friends sat at the table, one telling his story while wiping his tears with a piece of linen, the other listening thoughtfully as his friend explained how a day at work just a few days ago had been extremely different and difficult. He told his friend how he had not cared for his last assigned position. It was less physically demanding than most of his career assignments, but much more emotionally demanding. But he had adapted. He had handled difficult positions in his work before, and this one just required some mental changes, a little bit of delegation, and pretty soon it became a regular position he could handle. He had guys at work that he could horse around with, but he was their superior. They were his subordinates. So when the time came for responsibility, he did have to get serious. But serious doesn't begin to appropriately describe the feeling he had felt just a few days ago. He began to relate the events to his friend. His own words sound muffled in his ears as he spoke. The imagery was vivid and clear, though, and he knew that he would never escape it. He knew that those images, the sounds, the faces, none of them would ever leave him. They would haunt him for the rest of his life. Have you ever had that happen to you? An event that you witness stays with you and plays the images over and over in your brain, and no matter how you try, you can't stop the reruns from flickering across the screen of your subconscious. Most of us have had those events, and normally it's the bad events that seem to burn those slow-motion images so vibrantly into the mind's eye. But sometimes the good events can do the same. It was not a good event that our troubled storyteller was recounting to his friend. It was a terrible one. And his friend listened across the table. He didn't say a word. He held his tongue and looked down, occasionally shaking his hand, in an attempt to truly grasp all his friend was telling him. He wiped his face again and told of all the events that took place in the last 5 or 6 hours, leading up to what was to be the conclusion of his story. Events that he had done at work many, many times before, but this time it was different. Different in several ways. Different in the way one of those he was dealing with handled himself during the situation. Different in the number of people who showed up to watch him work. And he always had people to watch him do his job, but this time it was different. Primarily, it was different because of the last few moments leading up to the culmination of his story. Those last moments had shaken him like nothing in his career ever had. And not only him, his whole crew was shaken by the events of those last few moments. In fact, everyone present was shaken by what happened. He lifted his gaze from the floor between his feet and flatly stared across the table at his friend. He took the tattered cloth and covered his mouth. He didn't want his friend to see his chin quiver. He struggled to make any sound at all, but his next words found their way to his lips. He slid the linen down to his chin and shakily said, "And there, in the dark, I lifted my eyes and I watched. I watched as he cried out with a loud voice, something impossible for a man who had been hanging there that long to do, and then his life left his body. And he hung there on that cross, now lifeless, and my hands were the ones that nailed him there. And then the earth began to shake and tremble, and I looked at the 3 soldiers who were with me, and I said, 'Truly, this man was the Son of God.'" His friend looked intently into his eyes, placed his palms flat on the table, and rose from his chair. He leaned in close to his friend, and he spoke. He spoke not with condescending tone or with air of arrogance, but with the respect that only one centurion could give to another centurion. And he said, "I told you so. That very same man once healed my servant simply because I asked him to do so in good faith." He sat back down with his head between his hands, and his friend buried his face in a piece of the Savior's clothing, the very same one for which he had cast lots, and he wept. The Bible says the things written aforetime were written for our learning, and the Bible tells of 2 times that Jesus had interactions with Roman centurions. The first instance is recorded in Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10 tell us that after he had finished all of his sayings, he was entering into Capernaum. And there was a centurion who had a servant who was sick to the point of death, who was highly valued by him. And when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him the elders of the Jews, asking him to come to heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him. He loves our nation, and he's the one who built our synagogue." And when Jesus heard that, he went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to this one, go, and he goes. I say to another, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found so great faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant healed and well. The other centurion's story is recorded in Matthew chapter 27. This centurion and 3 other soldiers were given the task to crucify Jesus. These men were accustomed to death and cast lots for his garments, and then went about carrying on their gruesome task with cold efficiency until the events of the actual crucifixion began to sink into the minds of those hardened soldiers. They didn't know about the dead saints that rose from the tombs. They didn't see the veil of the temple be rent from top to bottom, but they saw the darkness fall on the earth, and they felt the earthquake beneath their feet. The Bible does not tell us whether these 2 centurions knew each other, though they worked for the same army in the province of Judea, which was not that large. Some historians have suggested that they were one and the same, but there's no evidence to support that. What could we possibly learn from these 2 men? One had faith simply upon hearing of the things Jesus was doing and who he was. The other obtained faith after witnessing what took place at Calvary. He watched Jesus ask for his forgiveness even as he drove the spike through his hand. He saw the large crowd of loved ones gather in support of this man. He heard him speak with kindness and compassion to a thief who was hanging on a cross beside him. He had seen the sun go dark. He had felt the earth tremble. All of this had caused him to make his declaration. I think many today are much like this soldier. They feel as though they need some miracle or grand event to spur them over the edge into deeper faith, or to have faith at all. And I don't know where you stand when it comes to the subject of faith, but I urge you, if you have none, or if your faith indeed is small, I urge you diligently to read Matthew 27. Stand at the base of the cross with a Roman centurion, with this understanding as you read. All that took place leading up to those last few hours, and all that took place in those last hours, was done for you, so that you might have God's grace and salvation. Stand there with that centurion witness, and with the mind's eye, as you see those horrible events, as you understand that it was done for you, I believe you too will take up the declaration and say, truly, this man was the Son of God. Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you have a great afternoon.